Let's take a look at Greek civilization as part of our study of classical civilizations and Greek civilization in particular. Alright, first of all, we're going to start off with sculpture. The Greeks were very well known for their sculpture and their artwork. Most of that work was, in fact, very lifelike, tended to be realistic, and often idealistic in its appearance. This example here is the discus thrower. It's a really good example because not only does it represent the realistic and idealistic features, but it also gives us a sense of the Greek ideal of perfection. This is sort of a philosophical idea that the Greeks held, that they saw the universe as sort of a harmonious and balanced place. And so they're going to try to reflect that in many of the things that they do. We'll see it in architecture, we'll see it in their philosophy, but we're also here, we see it in sculpture as well. The idea that this discus thrower, this athlete, is sort of the perfect man. Let's take a look at the picture a little bit close up in detail here. And we can see this is clearly the perfect human form. It's balanced, it's symmetrical. The guy's perfect in every way. Body fat, hair is perfect. It's basically a representation of what they consider to be that Greek ideal of perfection. The question we want to ask, though, was this really a realistic image of what people in ancient Greek looked like, or was it really this ideal? So let me take a second here and just switch the picture a little bit for you. Here we go. Okay, that may not be the Greek ideal of perfection any longer. Actually, it brings to mind the question about whether the degree to which this image truly reflected what people might have looked like, since clearly anybody we know that looks like this probably doesn't look really like that. So let's talk about what perfection today might really be about. If I take a look at this image, I'll see that the way that we look at the modern day of advertising and how we portray sort of the perfect body forms of people, that's not realistic either. Honestly, I don't know anybody that looks like this. I don't think I've ever met anybody that looks like this. And it's even questionable whether people in our society do look like this, or whether these are just sort of creations on magazines using Photoshop. But the reality is that what we consider to be attractive or beautiful or the perfect form may not actually represent what the majority of us actually look like. And that brings into mind, what did the ancient Greeks really look like? And that's hard to tell when just looking at their sculpture. So for the ancient Greeks, their concept of perfection was something like this. But is that really what people in ancient Greek look like on a daily basis? It's hard to say. We do know this. They certainly appreciated the perfect, balanced, symmetrical human form. Okay, they also participated in athletics. Now, we know that a strong, healthy citizen could help strengthen the city-state. Obviously, in a time of war, they could come to fight, they could defend the city. But it also brought glory and honor to their cities as they competed from one city-state to the other during athletic events. Okay, now these sporting events also were conducted to honor the gods as well. So they saw the human form as a representation of their god's creation, and they wanted to honor that. And of course, this all led to what we know as the Olympic Games. And in many ways, we also sort of respect and admire athleticism and athletic prowess and people's ability to maintain their bodies in a way that's sort of symbolic of maybe their personal beliefs, their religious beliefs, but also just the healthy lifestyle that usually goes with people living in a society that is focused on athletics and sports. Okay, the Greeks also had poetry and drama, and one of their most famous poets was Homer. And of course, the epics of Homer are great, but I'm not talking about this Homer. Okay, so this isn't the Homer we're talking about. The Homer we're talking about is this man right here. And what Homer is mostly famous for is actually writing these sort of poetic stories of most of what people really know as both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad is really the story of the Trojan War, and that's a fairly famous story. And the second part of that story is the Odyssey, which is the return trip of Odysseus from that conflict. And so if you've ever read any of these Greek classics, then you're basically reading the epics of Homer, these epic stories which are poems, but also are kind of historical accounts as well. We also have the poems of Sappho as well, so women also participated in writing poetry as well in ancient Greece. And then there are the comedies of Aristophanes. So comedy and theater was one of the great contributions of Greek civilization. And we also have the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles. So the concept of comedy and tragedy as in theater is really something that comes to us from the ancient Greeks. They also admired theater. And then there's the writing of history. Herodotus is considered to be the father of history, and that's because he wrote a book called The Persian Wars. The problem was that in this writing of history, he used a lot of myth and legend, so it's sort of mixed in with a little bit of historical truth, but it's also heavily dependent on myth and legend, and as a result, it's hard to tell whether most of this actually took place. And then there's Thucydides. Thucydides wrote a book called The Peloponnesian War. Now, he's considered to be really one of the first historians because he used interviews and first-hand accounts. He actually fought in the war, so he was familiar with what had taken place, and he knew people had fought in that war, so as a result, he was able to interview them, but he was also able to interview other people who had witnessed it firsthand. So again, Thucydides, actually the Peloponnesian War, is actually still required reading at the military academy down in West Point, so it's still considered to be a great book of basically warfare. And then there's architecture. And the most famous piece of architecture we have from ancient Greece, of course, is the Parthenon, and it is located on the Acropolis in Athens. And the Acropolis is this hill that was located in the midst of the city. And most ancient city-states had some kind of an Acropolis with some important structure on top of it. Now, the Acropolis, in this case, in Athens, the Parthenon, is actually dedicated to the goddess Athena. So she was the god of the city. And the building itself and the structure itself on top of the Acropolis really reflects a sense of perfect balance, okay? Particularly the Parthenon. It's a very balanced building. It represents that concept of harmony as well. Again, it's symmetrical. There's an equal number of pillars on the front, the back, the left, and the right sides, but it's very balanced and harmonious in the way that it's laid out. And it also reflects that concept of order in the universe. So balance, harmony, order of the universe. It's not just seen in sculpture, it's also seen in architecture, and the Parthenon is the great example of that reflection of their philosophical view of the universe. Here's a really great picture of it. It's an artist's concept of what it might look like, but you can see that it was a major structure on top of the Acropolis, but the Parthenon clearly stands out as part of that central part of that feature. Here's something that's interesting. The Parthenon today looks like it's in ruins. You got to keep in mind, up until the mid-1800s, this building was relatively intact. It was during that time period that it had been used as a storehouse for gunpowder. And during a regional local conflict, basically somebody lobbed some cannonballs into it and it exploded. And much of it had been sort of destroyed and damaged. But it was in pretty good shape up until that point. So it's interesting that it would last that long. And most of it's still standing. It's gone under a major renovation today. But within the middle of this building, there would have been a large statue of Athena. Now, what's interesting is that we harp back to this sort of architectural style to reflect not only balance and symmetry in architecture, but also many of the Greek ideals that we admire, such as democracy. And so in our own society, we've often modeled our own democratic institutions and buildings on this sort of model. So in this case here, we're looking at a picture of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's not an exact replica, but the concept is still there: balance, symmetry, and of course in the center of this building is a statue to Abraham Lincoln. Although not a god, it's somebody whose democratic principles and ideals that we look up to. Okay, and then there's the concept of being a soldier in ancient Greek society. The earliest forms of soldier were known as hoplites, and these were citizen soldiers. So these were people who obviously were citizens under the rights of, in Athens in particular, of the rights of citizenship, but they also had to fight as soldiers as well. They were primarily armed as spearmen with a shield, and so they were often referred to as an armored man. So the concept of a hoplite as an armored man. And again, they would sort of be ordinary citizens. They might even be farmer citizens, landholding nobles, but in a time of war, they would be called upon to come defend the city. The most famous politician of the time period for ancient Athens is Pericles, and he was the political leader of Athens from 495 to 429 BC. And again, he promoted the concept of democracy. Again, direct democracy, not quite the same kind of democracy that we would have today, a representative democracy, but the idea that democratic principles that characterize ancient Athenian society as opposed to the dictatorship of ancient Sparta. All right. He also commissioned magnificent sculptures and buildings to glorify Athens. In fact, he's responsible for building the Parthenon, the cost of which was an enormous amount of money that was acquired through Athens' allies in what was known as the Delian League. And as Athens collected sort of dues as part of the being in the Delian League, they used much of the money to build the Parthenon. And the problem with that was that the other members, the other allies and members of the Delian League, felt that the money had been spent to glorify Athens and not, equally distributed amongst the city-states. Hence, when Athens went to war under Pericles against Sparta during the Peloponnesian War, some of those allies did not feel so inclined to actually come to the aid of Athens because they felt that Athens had abused its own power within the Delian League. So there's something to be learned about politics there as well. You have to be balanced and harmonious in the way you conduct politics, as well as sculpting and building architecture and other such things.